Let's take John Lennon's song Imagine for a moment. Text 1 in the booklet. I'm sure I don't need to read it out to you. I'm sure you guys know it by heart. In fact, we could probably break into the song upon request. But essentially, if you analyze John Lennon's thesis, I would call it really, because I would refer to it as the Bible or the Constitution, even the anthem of liberalism, what essentially he says is that if only we eliminated those three things that distinguish one human being from another, we would all live as one. We would have brotherhood. We would have a utopian reality where we were all as one. What are those three things? Right? He starts off, no heaven, no earth, no religion. 2, religion. What's the second? No nations, no nationalities. And the third? No possessions. If we were to eliminate religion, if we were to liberate nationalism, national identities and boundaries, and if we were to eliminate the gap, the socioeconomical growing gap we hear so much about, what would we be left with? A world that would live as one. John Lennon's idea seems to be very accurate. The differences in the world and within humanity create inequality, create envy, disunity, and result in hate and violence. I'm reminded of the joke of two men sitting on a train and talking. One guy says, "Did you hear the one about the two Jews who are walking down the street?" The other guy says, "Hold it. Why are you always telling jokes about Jews? I find it offensive. Why must they always be about Jews?" "You're right," his friend replies, and he starts the joke again. So these two Chinese guys are walking down the street on their way to their nephew's bar mitzvah. So here's the thing. There are two problems with this sense of pure idealistic universalism proposed by John Lennon. The first, history has proven that Lennon's version of universalism simply does not work. What is the greatest recent example of this? Communism. Communism tried to eliminate all three of those great factors that get between people. It tried to eradicate religion. It tried to eradicate the difference, the socioeconomic gap between one another. And the third is it actually brought all those regions together in the Soviet Union, tried to eliminate boundaries as well. And how did that work out? It was an abject failure. It reminds me of the joke of a Brit, a Frenchman, and a Russian standing and staring at a beautiful portrait of Adam and Eve. "Look at the calm, look at the reserve," says the Brit. "They must be British." "Nonsense," replies the Frenchman. "They're so beautiful and mysterious. They must be French." The Russian finally pops up and says, "They have no clothes, no shelter, only an apple to eat, and are being told this is paradise. They must be Russian." So lest you argue that this was due to corruption, because there was a ton of corruption, you have the kibbutz movement, which lacked corruption, I would say. There was such idealism there, lived by similar principles, in fact. And it, too, didn't survive the test of time. And why? Because it ignores and denies fundamental human nature. I want to draw your attention to text 3, a letter of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, where he weighs in on the kibbutz movement. It's quite a long letter. I want to just highlight the bit in bold. In and of itself, the most apparent function of the commune is to equalize individuals of greater and lesser stature, something that runs contrary to human nature. For with human beings, just as their faces are different from one another, so too are their minds and characters different from one another. A person thus finds satisfaction and fulfillment when he is given the opportunity to actualize his potentials, not so much in those areas which he shares in common with his fellows, but rather in those areas in which he as an individual is superior to his compatriots and his society, for in these areas lies his uniqueness. Not included in the text, but an interesting study was done where social scientists asked a group of people if they would prefer to make, for argument's sake, 200,000 pounds, but the rest of their peers would make an identical amount, or they would prefer to make 150,000 pounds, but their peers would make 100,000 pounds. Do you know what most people chose? 150,000 pounds, so long as everyone else made 100. Interesting. Objectively, they would have less, but subjectively, they would have more than others. And so there is this inbuilt nature within each one of us to strive for distinction, for self-expression and actualization. In other words, there are these two basic drives in humankind, as we shall soon see. Selfhood on the one hand, service on the other. Acquisition on the one hand, altruism on the other. Distinction and devotion. We are not monolithic creatures, we are multifaceted. And this reminds me of the joke about self-preservation. Two explorers hear the sound of a lion, and the first looks around for a place to hide for him and his friend. The second puts on his running shoes. The first says, "You're crazy. You can't run faster than a lion." The second one says, "I don't need to run faster than the lion. I just need to run faster than you." On a bit of a lighter note, a joke about altruism. An upset and concerned housewife named Rivka sprang to the phone when it rang and listened with relief to the kindly voice. "Darling, how are you? It's Mama." "Oh, Mama," she says, "I'm having a terrible day." Breaking into bitter tears, she says, "The baby won't eat. The washing machine broke down. I haven't had a chance to go shopping. And besides, I just sprained my ankle. I have to hobble around. And on top of that, the house is a terrible mess, and I've invited the Goldbergs and the Rosens over for dinner." The voice, on the other hand, says in deep sympathy, "Darling, let Mama handle it." She continued, "Sit down, relax, close your eyes. I'll be over in half an hour. I'll do your shopping. I'll clean the house. I'll cook your dinner. I'll feed the baby. I'll call the repairman. Stop crying. I'll do everything. In fact, I'll even call your husband David at the office, and I'll tell him he ought to come home and help you out for once." "David?" says Rivka. "Who's David?" "Why, David's your husband. Is this 223-1374? "No," she says, "this is 223-1375. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I guess I have the wrong number." There was a short pause, then Rivka said, "Does this mean you're not coming over?" We see the fact that we are not monolithic but are created with two distinct opposite drives in the writings of Rabbi Soloveitchik. Let's look at text 4. And he points out something fascinating about the biblical account of creation, a seeming inconsistency that has led to tremendous discussion. The Torah offers two accounts of the creation of man, one in the first chapter and the second in the second chapter. The explanation of the differences between them lies not in an imaginary contradiction between two traditions, but in a very real contradiction in the nature of the very same man. There are two Adams, two types, two representatives of humanity. The first Adam is majestic man, aggressive, bold, and victory-minded. His motto is success, to harness and dominate the elemental natural forces and to put them at his disposal. Employing the divine image in which he is formed, his intellect and creativity, he builds, plans, harvests, regulates rivers, etc., creates beauty and constructs mathematized models of the cosmos. The second Adam is covenantal man. His goal is not success, but redemptiveness. He seeks not control over his environment, but control over himself. Not to confront and defeat mute nature, but to allow himself to be confronted and defeated by a higher and truer being. Not to advance to the outer reaches of his universe, but to retreat to its center. Hence the differences in the two accounts. While the first Adam exults in his divine image, the second is ever aware that his body is a handful of dust sustained by the breath of God. Where God summons the first Adam to exercise mastery, to fill the earth and conquer it, the second Adam is summoned to serve, to cultivate the garden, to keep it. And in every one of us abides these two personas. Both strive to be themselves, to be what God commanded them to be, namely man. Hence the abiding. Okay, and then he continues with his personal conclusion, and that's the title of his book, The Lonely Man of Faith. Now, what's very interesting to note is that sometime earlier, the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad Hasidism, essentially laid the seeds of this particular idea based on Kabbalistic thought in his magnum opus, the Tanya. So we can turn to text 5, and you'll see there a quote from the Tanya where he says, "Every Jew, whether righteous or wicked, possesses two souls, as it is written, and neshamot, souls in the plural, which I have made. One soul is clothed in the blood of a human being, and from this soul stem all the selfish characteristics. The second soul is truly chelek Elokah, a part of God above." So here too we find expression of the internal, intrinsic duality within human nature and drive. One selfish, the other selfless. One focused on acquisition, the other altruism. What's fascinating about this is that, bothered by the question that if altruists busy looking for hiding spots for others, are eaten by the lions, how does altruism continue to exist? Even Darwin, perhaps one of the greatest proponents of the selfish drive for survival within each human being, comes to acknowledge an altruistic gene in mankind. And in a little-known quote from this book he later wrote called The Descent of Man, in text 6, he writes, "For firstly, the social instincts lead one to take pleasure in the society of his fellows, to feel a certain amount of sympathy with them, to perform various services for them. And such actions as the above appear to be the simple result of the greater strength of the social or maternal instincts than that of any other instinct or motive, for they are performed too instantaneously for reflection or for pleasure or even the misery that might be felt." And what's very interesting about this is that there was a phenomena that many of the rabbis address, which is, why is it that in the account of creation, the human being was created as a single unit and all other creatures created in pairs? And there are three answers we're going to address over the course of this talk. The first one is text 7. It seems like perhaps the most narcissistic statement you might ever encounter. Text 7. "It was for this reason that man was first created as one person to teach you. Chayav Adam Lemar, person must say, Bishvili nivra ha'olam, for me, for my sake, was the world created." How self-centered it would seem. Reb Nachman of Breslov famously taught something beautiful. The day you were born is the day God decided that the world could not exist without you. But then we have a second interpretation, text 8, that says, and also, why was humanity created in the single? To promote peace among the nations, that no man would say to his friend, "My ancestors are greater than yours." And in text 9, you'll find a beautiful letter the Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote to the president of Poland after an anti-Semitic episode happens there, and the president writes to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe highlights this particular point. It was God's design that the human race, all humans everywhere and at all times, should know that each and all descend from the one and the same single progenitor, a fully developed human being created in the image of God, so that no human being could claim superior ancestral origin. In other words, the very same phenomena, the very same biblical fact, that of the human being being created single, teaches two opposite things, addressing two opposite drives. The one highlighting the self, highlighting that self-absorption and self-centeredness, the idea that the world revolves around me, and it's for me to self-actualize and to self-determine, and to self-express. And the other saying, don't get too carried away with that idea that you are the center of the world, because that might bring you to feel superior to others. In fact, we all come from one, because on one level we all originate in one. There is a beautiful story told about Rabbi Simcha Bunim of Pshischa, one of the great Hasidic masters. And it is said that he used to carry two slips of paper, one in each pocket. On the one it said, the statement before, Bishvili nivra ha'olam, the world is created for my sake. But on the other there was a quote from Avraham Avinu, Va'anochi afar va'efer, which means I am but dust and ashes. And he would take out a slip of paper as necessary, sometimes the one, sometimes the other, as a balance between those two intrinsic drives within us. Hillel, the great sage, put it so beautifully when he said, Im ein ani li mili, uchshe'ani la'atzmi ma'ani. If I am not for myself, who will be? But if I am only for myself, what am I? I believe those two statements address these two intrinsic drives within us. So the first problem with universalism is it simply denies the human nature within each of us to self-distinguish, to be unique, to feel special, to achieve something that only we can achieve and be noticed for it. And therefore, pure universalism is simply not practical. But I want to go further and suggest that not only isn't it practical, it is not ideal. In other words, let's say we could resolve the practical problems with pure universalism. Would we endeavor to do so from a religious viewpoint? Judaism says no. Because pure universalism, the elimination of all distinction within human beings, is actually less than ideal. Let's look at text 11. Going back to that point about the singular creation of human being. Why was man created? Single, says the Mishnah, to express the grandeur of the Holy One. For a man strikes many coins from the same die, and all the coins are alike. But the King of Kings, strikes every man from the die of the first man, and yet no man is quite like his friend. In other words, the complement, that is to say, the unique abilities of God express themselves not in creating monolithic creatures, but rather creatures of diversity. As was so beautifully put by a wonderful Jewish thinker, the revolution of Jewish monotheism is that unity up there creates diversity down here. Unity up there creates diversity down here. And this explains a very interesting comment of the Hasidic masters. In the Shema, the famous Jewish teaching of monotheism, the final word of the Shema is Hashem Echad. It should have or could have said Hashem Yachid. The difference between the two is Yachid means the one and only. Echad means the one. And here we come to a very important idea in Hasidism. The difference between singularity or unity. What's the difference between singularity and unity? Unity means bringing separate things together and exposing the underlying oneness or commonality between them. In singularity, there was no other to begin with. Echad means exposing the aleph, the oneness within the chet, because the second letter of the word echad is chet, and the numerical value is 8, which in Jewish law comes to represent the 7 heavens and the 1 earth. The final letter of the word echad, which is enlarged, by the way. Next time you look at a siddur, recognize that daled, which is enlarged, comes to represent the 4 corners of the world. In other words, diversity. The ideal oneness of monotheism is not singularity, but unity. Hashem Echad rather than Yachid. In fact, the Torah begins with the letter Bet, another subject of much discussion. Numerically, Bet is 2. Why not Aleph or 1? Because creation is the process of creating multiplicity within this universe and a certain sense of apparent duality. What's the first letter of the 10 Commandments? Aleph. Because it is the one of the 10 Commandments of the Torah that allows us to expose the oneness within the apparent duality in which the world was created. Historically, here's a question for you all. Historically, in the Bible, which generation envisioned a world without diversity and aspired to a utopian version of universalism? Sorry? Very good. The Tower of Babel. We're going to read it in the Torah, in the text. Let's go to text 12. Now the entire earth was of one language and uniform words. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and fire them thoroughly." I'm going to skip around a little bit. "Let us build ourselves a city, lest we be scattered." How does the Torah continue? This, for some reason, evoked or touched a nerve, a divine nerve. And what happens? The Lord descended to see the city and the tower that the sons of man had built. And the Lord said, "They are one people, they have one language, and this is what they have commenced to do? Let us descend and confuse their language, so that no one will not understand the language of his companion." Therefore he named it Babel, for there the Lord confused the language of the entire earth, and from there the Lord scattered them upon the face of the entire earth. And I ask you, what could possibly be wrong about this seemingly wonderful expression, first iteration of the United Nations? A wonderful embodiment of unity, of coalescence, of coming together, lest we be scattered throughout the earth. Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Netziv, has something very profound to say. Text 14. They were the first social engineers, hoping to create a utopian society where all lived and thought as one. They feared that if some people would settle their own colonies and towns, they would develop their own cultures and unique modes of living. They wanted everyone to live in one controlled environment where they would be able to make sure that all remained culturally homogeneous. The tower served as a base around which all people of their planned colony would settle, no one leaving its immediate environs. The problem with their plan was that it was the first step towards a tyrannical state where no individual expression would be tolerated, and God split them into separate nations. And where do we find, my friends, the counter-argument to the generation of Babel in the Torah embodied in one particular family? At what point in Jewish history do things evolve to become more diverse? Multiple paths, multiple ways to find your inner truth. Jacob, 12 tribes, different flags. The Midrash says that the creation of the concept of flags comes from the children of Jacob. Imagine that. Among all the other things Jews can claim credit for creating, we created the first flags. Tribalism, in a certain sense, if you will, is a Jewish invention. There were 12 separate stones on the breastplate of the high priest to demonstrate the celebration rather than the elimination of diversity. The 12 tribes had different mascots. They encamped in 12 different ways. And then when the land was apportioned, it was apportioned in 12 different regions, or postcodes, so to speak. So in short, at this point, I wanted to point out that we have seen that universalism is not the answer for two reasons. Number one, it's not practical. And number two, it is not ideal. But the obvious question, the elephant in the room is particularism the answer? Doesn't particularism, by definition, exclude others and create the us versus them mentality? Don't differences create separation rather than unity? Isn't nationalism and religion responsible for so much violence and war? And what I'd like to propose in the next few minutes is that it depends what type of particularism you're referring to. And to understand this, we need to understand the difference between general particularism and Jewish particularism. Jewish particularism does not exclude other forms of particularism, and it does not see itself as the only path for everyone. So while the God of the Jewish people, we believe, is for everyone, the religion of the Jewish people is not. I'll give you a few examples. You may know this, of course, but Judaism is the only major religion that has no interest in seeing others join. Not only do we not proactively look for converts, we dissuade potential converts 3 times, no less, in the belief that every human being has their own pathway to God. And you don't need to be Jewish to be redeemed. In other religions, if you don't believe in their particular train of thought or belief system or individual who is the Messiah or whatnot, you're branded a heretic or an infidel with no path towards redemption. Judaism teaches that everyone can achieve personal redemption. Let me share with you one of the most radical religious texts, that of Maimonides, text 15. Maimonides says, anyone who accepts upon himself the fulfillment of these 7 mitzvot, he's referring to the Noahide code of law, which I would call the universal religion Judaism creates for every human being, which includes such basic principles like do not murder, do not commit incest, etc., etc., is precise in their observance, is considered one of the pious among the Gentiles, and will merit a share in the world to come. Paradise, my dear friends, is for everyone, not just for Jews. In the Torah, the first Jew, the father of Judaism, as it were, Abraham, does not only pray for those he disagrees with sharply, i.e. the natives, the citizens of the town Sodom. He fights for those people. He wars with other kings to preserve and save them. He puts his life in danger for the very people who stand for everything he stands against. On Sukkot, you may know that we offer 70 offerings, one corresponding to each one of the general 70 nations of the world. Sukkot is the Jewish holiday for Gentiles. We pray not just for the Jewish well-being, but that of every single human being on this planet, as embodied by an actual sacrifice committed and dedicated to each one of the nations. In the UK, I don't think this exists in the States, many synagogues, including ours, have a special prayer we say for the Queen. Moreover, our religious identity does not preclude a national identity. In other words, you don't need to choose one or the other, because, as text 16 points out, in Judaism, dina de malchuta dina, there is a certain integration of Jewish religious law and the local government law. The law of the land becomes religious law for Jews. Point number 2, not only does Jewish particularism not preclude or exclude other forms of particularism, in fact, I'd like to propose You may agree or disagree, but I'd like to propose that not only does Judaism's form of particularism tolerate universalism, it invented universalism. I have a friend who's a Chabad rabbi on campus in Northern California, and he tells me that he sometimes goes out to engage with the students, and he'll ask some of the students, "Excuse me, sir or ma'am, are you Jewish?" And he says, without fail, every one of them that responds to the question, "Are you Jewish?" by saying, "No, I am human," is Jewish. That's a very Jewish response. Judaism gave birth to the revolutionary idea that every single human being was created in the divine image. And indeed, this helped shape the sensibility, the Jewish sensibility that always leans towards universalism in so many different contexts, too many to elaborate on. But let me share with you a beautiful text from Edmund Wilson, a U.S. literary critic and author. Text 18. The Jew lends himself easily to communism because it enables him to devote himself to a high cause involving all of humanity, characteristics which are natural to him as a Jew. Another fascinating expression of this is a young Polish-Jewish ophthalmologist whose name was L.L. Zamenhof. You may know him as the inventor of a universal language called Esperanto. It was a failed experiment, but the idea behind it is very Jewish. Why did he try to create a universal language, one which every human being spoke in unison, in the hope of eliminating hate and disunity, of creating a certain sense of brotherhood within all? Text 19 is a fascinating excerpt of a letter where he describes his motivation for creating this language. The place where I was born and spent my childhood gave direction to all my future struggles. In Bialystok, the inhabitants were divided into 4 distinct elements: Russians, Poles, Germans, and Jews. Each of these spoke their own language and looked on all the others as enemies. In such a town, a sensitive nature feels more acutely than anywhere else the misery caused by language division and sees at every step that the diversity of language is the first, or at least the most influential basis for the separation of the human family into groups of enemies. Was brought up an idealist. I was taught that all people were brothers, while outside in the street at every step I felt that there were no people, only Russians, Poles, Germans, Jews, and so on. This was always a great torment to my infant mind, although many people may smile at such an anguish for the world in a child, since at that time I thought that grown-ups were omnipotent, so I often said to myself that when I grow up, I would certainly destroy this evil. What a beautiful sentiment, coming from someone Jewish, and the sensibility itself reflecting the religious teaching that all men are created equal, and the religious aspiration towards a world where lion will lie with lamb, a world in which envy, hatred, is eliminated through the process of what we refer to as the Messianic era. In fact, the notion of a Messianic era was first imagined and articulated by our prophets. I draw your attention to text 17, a quote from Isaiah, in which the prophet says, "I will bring them to my holy mount, and I will cause them to rejoice in my house of prayer." We say this on the high holidays, on Yom Tif, "Ki beisi beis tefila yikareh lechol ha'amim." My house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. My dear friends, how radical is that? That is not coming from a secular humanistic approach. That is coming from a religious text, one envisioned, imagined thousands of years ago when people were busy eliminating one person, a nation, and one at a time. They were busy offering their children as human sacrifices, etc., etc. That's the world in which this seed of universalism was planted and first imagined. So Jewish particularism does not only not preclude universalism, in fact, it creates universalism. That's point number 2. But let's go a little bit deeper. And with this particular idea, I will going to conclude the talk. The truth is that Jewish particularism doesn't only tolerate or aspire to universalism. In fact, it enables universalism. But to understand this, we have to first return to the very first individual in the Torah to write the earliest version of John Lennon's song, Imagine. Who am I referring to? Sorry? A little bit before him? In the 5 books of the Torah? Who was the first Jew to write the song Imagine? Let's go to text 23. Korach. You know what Korach said? Kulam kedoshim. Umadua tisnasa'u al kahal Hashem. The entire congregation is holy, and God is within each one of them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the community of God? Now, does that resonate? It should. It's a very Jewish idea. We always talk about the fact that there is no intermediary between one Jew and God. We always talk about the fact that every Jew was present at Sinai. Every Jew heard the word of God. We don't need anything to get between us and our relationship with God. No Jew is superior or inferior to another, etc. What Korach was saying essentially was, imagine there was no Moses, no Aaron, no sanctuary, no Kohenites, Levites, or Israelites, and no religious authorities too. It's easy if you try. And then Jews would live as one. And what was wrong with Korach's complaint? He was pointing out a glaring inconsistency within Judaism. If in fact we are all created equal, and all in the image of God, and all of us heard the word of God, who spoke to each one of us individually in the first person, in the singular, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am God, your God. Not Elokechem, yours in the plural, but yours in the singular, to each and every one of us. How come there is hierarchy in Judaism? How do you explain away this seeming blind spot to the idea of egalitarianism, the idea of a Jewish caste system, my friends? Is that not what Kohen Levi Yisrael is? It's an ontological condition. It's not merit-based. You all know the joke about the Kohen, right? The fellow who comes to the rabbi and he says to the rabbi, Rabbi, please, I'll give you a lot of charity if you can turn me into a Kohen. Rabbi says, it doesn't work like that. No amount of money in the world can enable you to become a Kohen. And the negotiations continue back and forth until finally the rabbi says, tell me something, sir. Why do you want to become a Kohen so badly? He says, well, it's because my father was a Kohen before me, and his father before him. So, to be a Kohen is an ontological fact. It's not something you earn or merit. How does that jive with the Jewish idea of egalitarianism? Did you know that according to Jewish law, a Kohen, of course, is called up to the Torah first. He's honored above and beyond all others. Then there goes the Levi. He's given the first offer when it comes to benching, Birkat HaMazon, the Zimun. If there are 3 or more adults in the room, there's Zimun. He gets the honors first. He is served before others at a meal, according to Halacha. So what's the answer? The answer is that the difference between the Jewish caste system and the secular caste system is that in Judaism, those at the top serve those at the bottom. In the secular system, those at the bottom serve those at the top. That's a fundamental difference. In Judaism, those at the top serve those at the bottom. In the general caste system, those at the bottom serve those at the top. You see, the Kohen was a public servant. He led a very restricted lifestyle. He couldn't go to certain places, he couldn't eat certain foods, and he always had to maintain a level of purity, which was very restrictive, in order that he could facilitate the purity of others. He was dependent on the congregation for his livelihood. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the Kohen had to cut his hair very regularly. He wasn't allowed to have long hair. And the reason for this is because according to the Zohar, hair is a symbol of self-expression. The Hebrew word for hair is sa'ar. Same letters write the word sha'ar, which means a gate, because one's hair is a portal into their personality, into their inner world of feelings. The Zohar has a chapter about different colors, textures, the lengths of hair. Fascinating. So the Kohen could not grow his hair because he was meant to embody self-effacement, self-abnegation, service for the other, for the community, for those who were impure, who stood and acted against the principles he embodied, which is purity. And by the way, this was not limited to the Kohen, the Levi as well. He was dependent on the community for livelihood. He also could not own property. The Levites were not able to own a piece of land. They had to live on communal property. As the verse says, the Lord said to Aaron, you shall not inherit their land, and you shall have no portion among them. In other words, the Kohanim and the Leviim didn't see the community as being there to help them actualize themselves, but they saw themselves as being there to help actualize the community. And this, my friends, is what we honor when we give a Kohen or a Levi an aliyah to the Torah before the Israel. We are honoring the ideal, the value that they embody, which is the value of service. Text 24, we read from the Mishnah, a beautiful teaching. Ezehu mechubad hamechabed et acherim. Who is honored? He who honors others. And I believe the Kohen and Levi embody that particular teaching to perfection. And the same principle applies to the ultimate and to the most deeply misunderstood expression of particularism in history, in our history at least, the notion that we are Am HaNivchar, that our entire people are called the chosen people, the chosen nation. Has there been one sentiment in our history that has been so deeply misunderstood and has created so much calamity and destruction in its wake? It does not get more particular than that than to call yourselves the chosen nation among all other nations. But you know what's interesting? Which metaphor does the Torah use to describe Jewish chosenness? In the Bible itself, Va'atem tihiyu li mamlechet kohanim, and you shall be for me a kingdom of priests. The correlation to priests is not random or arbitrary. It's incredibly precise. Because in a similar vein, it comes to illuminate what it means. What is the definition of this Jewish chosenness? We were chosen not to be served, but to serve. As the prophets would teach, that the Jewish people have a mission statement, or lagoyim, to illuminate their environment and to be a light unto the nations. And one might say that we too as a people were homeless, like the Kohen and the Levi, for much of our history, for the purpose of disseminating Jewish teachings throughout the world. Here's a beautiful excerpt of a letter of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, text 25. The above provides an insight into the meaning of galut, the exile and dispersion among the nations of the world. God has ordained a certain group or people, namely the Jewish people, to carry the difficult and challenging task of spreading in all parts and remotest corners of the world the unity of God, true monotheism, through living and spreading the light of Torah and mitzvot, a task which no other group was willing or capable of carrying out. The greatest reward is the fulfillment of this destiny, or as our sages put it, the reward of a mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. Thus, the ultimate purpose of galut, which means dispersion of the Jewish people, in other words, the exile, is linked with our destiny to help bring humanity to a state of universal recognition of God. Have we been successful? I want to share with you a few quotes, not from Jewish thinkers or rabbis, so self-congratulatory Jewish leaders patting the Jewish people collectively on the back, but rather from non-Jewish thinkers, some of them actually somewhat hostile to the Jewish existence. Here we have a beautiful letter from John Adams, the second president of the United States. I will insist the Hebrews have contributed more to civilized men than any other nation. They have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern. T.R. Grover, mankind, East and West, Christian and Muslim, accepted the Jewish conviction that there is only one God. Today it is polytheism that is so difficult to understand, that is so unthinkable. And one of my favorites, by Paul Johnson, text 28. Certainly the world without the Jews would have been a radically different place. Humanity might have eventually stumbled on all the Jewish insights, but we cannot be sure. All the great conceptual discoveries of the human intellect seem obvious and inescapable once they have been revealed, but it requires a special genius to formulate them for the first time. The Jews had this gift. To them we owe the idea of equality before the law, both divine and human, of the sanctity of life and the dignity of human person, of the individual conscience, and so a personal redemption, of collective conscience, and so of social responsibility, of peace as an abstract ideal, and love as the foundation of justice, and many other items which constitute the basic moral furniture of the human mind. And here's the clincher. Without Jews, it might have been a much emptier place. So have we served as priests to the universe throughout our history? Without a question. Have we totally transformed the language of morality? Have we transformed the landscape of morality? 1,000%. Finally, text 29, Thomas Cale, The Gift of the Jews. The Jews started it all, and by it I mean so many of the things we care about, the underlying values that make all of us, Jew and Gentile, believer and atheist, tick. Without the Jews, we would see the world through different eyes, hear with different ears, even feel with different feelings. We would think with a different mind, interpret all our experiences differently, draw different conclusions from the things that befall us, and we would set a different course for our lives. And so, in summation, I'd like to propose that the solution to the tension created by globalization and nationalism is Judaism, or is the Jewish form of particularism. Let me share with you a personal story. In our community in central London, we have quite an international group of Jewish people who have moved there from all parts of the world for different reasons. And one of the families that moved over from Israel. And I don't know if you know this, but what we would call secular Jews abroad cannot compare to secular Israelis, in the sense that there's a certain illiteracy among secular Israelis that's simply unmatched outside of Israel, unfortunately, tragically, and unexpectedly. And this particular family, just to give you an example, had never gone to the Kotel until we did the bar mitzvah of their son. The father was 65 years old, grew up in Tel Aviv. He never took the trip an hour away to Jerusalem. That's how secular his family was. There was no place for Jerusalem in their lives. Tel Aviv was like Miami, or Miami is really like Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv was like any other city in the world. In any event, 3 or 4 summers ago, we had a family reunion. And in the middle, I get an email from the wife of this gentleman, a lovely person. Her name is, well, we'll leave her unnamed. And in the email, I get a picture, and I see a very interesting sight. I see a picture of a group, it would seem, of African indigenous population, and a little child who, after some scrutiny, appears to be her son, named Sammy, nestled between this large group of African people. And I read the quote at the bottom, and she says, Rabbi Mendel, I wanted to send you this picture. This is a picture of our son, Sammy. A few months ago, Sammy came home after learning about the principle of tzedakah, of Jewish charity, and he said that he wants to help the people of Africa. And so he called up all of his friends, all of the parents' friends, and he began to raise money from them. By the way, he's 6 years old. And he raised 600 pounds. The family topped that up by quite a few zeros. And they traveled to a part of Africa they were told needs support. And they spent a week ensuring that there was greater infrastructure in that part of the world. And she ends off the note and she says, without his studies at the Cheder, at the Gan, without learning about the Jewish principle of tzedakah, this African group of people would not have been benefited. Thank you so much for the Jewish education. Is that not an amazing example, a picture, a snippet, an anecdote that brings to life the idea, the powerful idea that the more Jewish we are, the more human we become? The more particular we are with our tradition, the better positioned we become to be citizens of the world. In an era where younger people are growing up without a defined, prescribed, natural identity, looking for that identity. We deal with this so much in London, in a very international city, in the best schools in England and perhaps beyond. How to navigate the tensions between universalism and particularism. And I always share this particular point, that the stronger and more connected and identified your child will be with their Jewishness, the more they will connect to the Jewish value of universalism, the Jewish invention of universalism, the Jewish particularism that does not exclude other forms of particularism, but celebrates them. The Jewish particularism doesn't annihilate or eliminate diversity, but celebrates diversity. Jewish monotheism, which teaches that unity up there creates diversity down here. So let me conclude with a quote from Maimonides, who said, in his envisioning of the world coming to a place of tikkun olam, which essentially means all of humanity working towards global solutions in a globalized world. This will usher in an era with neither famine or war, envy or competition, when good will flow in abundance and all the delights will be freely available as dust, and the occupation of the entire world will be solely to know God. May it be speedily in our days. Thank you very much. We have a minute or two for questions.
One of the things you pointed out was that there was diversity because there were different tribes, and there was some hierarchy there, but there was also hierarchy within the tribes because each tribe had a prince.
Yes.
And we also talked about not ever being able to eliminate poverty, so that the wealthy can give tzedakah.
So I just want to, so you're making 2 points. The first point is that within the Jewish community there were leaders, there were princes that were elevated above all others. And the basic response to that is that they were not seen as people served by the population, but people who served the population. So they were a king, a Jewish king, had an additional mitzvah to the rest of the Jewish people. There was a mitzvah for all Jewish people to have a Torah scroll written. A king had to have 2 written. Why the second? So that he always has that reminder that the people are there to be served rather than to serve, to introduce that extra element of humility. And as far as tzedakah is concerned, I think that's actually a very good point, because let me share with you a very interesting point in tzedakah that reflects the 2 different drives within human being. On the one hand, the Torah legislates, obligates the giving of tzedakah, 10% of one's earnings, ma'aser. So it actually enforces, in a certain sense, the expression of selflessness, as it were, at least in a certain limited context. But conversely, to the best of my knowledge, Judaism is the only religion that places a cap on how much tzedakah you could give. Right? What does the Talmud say? A person shouldn't give more than 20%. By the way, if you need a loophole, I know certain rabbis who are happy to help. The Alter Rebbe gives a very beautiful explanation as to why one can give more than 20%. It's not the time to go into right now. But the point is, what is Judaism saying? That yes, give of yourself, but not so much of yourself that you are no longer self-sufficient. Right? That's the principle. Like in the planes, they say, make sure you have your oxygen mask on before you help someone else. Because if everyone is giving so much, everyone will then become dependent on one another. And that's not a healthy principle. They say Margaret Thatcher once said something very profound. She was the MP for an area in London called Finchley, which is a very Jewish neighborhood. And she said in, I think, 20 years of representation of Finchley, never once did one Jew come to her seeking financial help. Never once was there a case where a Jew left the Jewish community to look for support outside of the Jewish community. I had the fascinating anecdote with a friend of mine from South Africa. And he's a very wealthy man, so he has private insurance in the UK. But private hospitals are not open past a certain time. So I think around midnight or earlier, maybe even, they closed. And he had kidney stones, and it was so unbearable that he needed to see a doctor immediately. So he went to the NHS because he couldn't get into the private hospital. While he is in the NHS, the person looking after him says to him, let me give you a little tip. The next time you have a problem like this, instead of coming to the NHS, like many others who come to the A&E, the emergency room, and then you're put in a line and it takes you some time to be processed and admitted, call the ambulance. Because when the ambulance comes, they get the process started and they bring you straight to the public hospital, and you can go straight in, so you save some time. Fantastic. Very important information. Unfortunately, a few weeks later, he still had a problem. What does he do? He calls the ambulance. He's in the ambulance, and while he's lying there being processed, a Gentile worker, one of the fellows working at the ambulance, tells him, I have a tip for you. He says, what is it? He says, the next time you have a problem like this, don't call the ambulance. Call a certain organization called Hatzalah. Hatzalah means to save. He's telling my friend who's Jewish, but the guy doesn't know. He says, if you call them, he said, the waiting time is shortened dramatically, and they are a Jewish organization, they have lots of Jewish people, they can get you into a private hospital. But he says, it's a free service, so I would recommend you make a donation to Hatzalah. Unbelievable. A Gentile in an ambulance having a conversation with a Jew, telling the Jew about an organization that cuts the time down to help others, not necessarily Jews, because he's talking to, in his view, someone who isn't Jewish, but any human being. This is the value of Jewish particularism, my dear friends. I think there's no greater example in an anecdote of that particular value of Jewish particularism, which not just tolerates, celebrates, invents, but enables universalism.